So now we move to the age of Andrew Jackson. Here you see a caricature of Andrew Jackson showing his propensity for dueling. He was, as many people would have agreed, the first clinical psychopath actually to be in the White House. When he thundered by the Eternal, you knew he was going to be reaching for a pistol and challenging you to a duel, which he had about 4 or 5 times in his life. He was also subject to an assassination attempt, which his coat managed to block, and he then turned on his attacker and beat him over the head with a cane. Yes, this was quite an interesting figure, Andrew Jackson. We'll see the election of 1828 and the second party system, the first term of Jackson, the Western question, the Trail of Tears, and nullification. Okay, this page of notes, you're not going to have to know any of the details for quizzes or tests or anything. But I do want to give you a sort of a background of the person we know as Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. He was the first member of the non-gentry into in the White House. He is actually the first Irish American in the White House. His parents were actually born in Ulster in Northern Ireland. He was born in the Carolina backwoods in 1767. He served during the Revolution as a courier at age 13. He had a sporadic formal education, but became an outstanding young lawyer in Tennessee. Married to Rachel Donaldson, he engaged in brawls and duels. He was prosperous enough to purchase slaves and build a mansion, the Hermitage, in Nashville, Tennessee. He's the first man elected from Tennessee to the House, and he served briefly in the Senate. He was a friend of Daniel Boone. He was a mentor to Davy Crockett. He was a hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He received much of the credit for the Florida annexation, and he cast himself as a representative of the common man. And there you see the Hermitage, located in Nashville, Tennessee, a very good historical tour. Should you ever wish to go there, I highly recommend it. With the formation of the Democratic Party, led by Andrew Jackson, which called itself at the time the Party of Democracy, which is how it got its name. And it was called the Democratic Party. It was never, ever called the Democrat Party. Jackson is the leader of this party. It is a national party. It is the first truly national party in the country. Led by Jackson, it consisted of Northern outsiders, that is, those that were not part of the Federalist sphere, dissident Democratic Republicans led by John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Westerners like Thomas Hart Benton, whom you see in the daguerreotype photograph. Daguerreotype is a photograph that is made with a silver plate as a negative, which means it's more lasting. However, it's rarer. And the platform of the Democratic Party was a platform of states' rights. And this traces all the way back to the Alien and Sedition Acts and the 10th Amendment. Democratic ideals. And what do I mean by democratic ideals? Expanding the vote so that more white men could vote. That is, reducing the franchise, the property requirement, and increasing the vote. And Jeffersonian simplicity, that is, the way Jefferson would have done things, wearing simple clothing, eschewing titles like Your Excellency and things like that. In 1828, Jackson, who rides a wave of popular dissatisfaction with the John Quincy Adams administration, wins the vote 178 to 83 in the Electoral College, and he takes 56% of the popular vote, which means that he wins the popular vote by more than 10 points. When you win the popular vote by more than 10 points in any presidential election, that is considered what is called a mandate. That is, you are overwhelmingly elected and the people are behind you. 1.4 million people cast votes, and it shows you that the American electorate is expanding. Remember that the old Federalists and even some of the Democratic Republicans had never envisioned that the vote would be so universal and so widespread. Of course, they didn't understand that the nation was going to be as large as it was even in 1828. In case you needed to understand why it is that the current Trump administration has been such a fan of Andrew Jackson, what you need to understand is how the Jackson administrations, both of them, flipped the federal dynamic on its head. The founders of the country had never envisioned that the president, the executive, would be primary in the government. It was always supposed to be the legislative branch, that Congress would run the domestic sphere of the country, and that the president would provide a check and balance on that, but that the president's role was really in foreign policy and defense of the country. Well, Jackson now begins to turn this and puts the presidency foremost. And he does this in a very, very sort of popular way, a populist way, and especially through the spoil system. He gives out patronage. Patronage is giving jobs to those who support you in an election. And now you start to see Jackson pulling federal employees out of their positions and replacing them with party loyalists. Now, competency was an issue here, obviously. When you remove somebody who's very good at their job and replace them with somebody who's very poor because they're party loyalists, that's not always a good thing. And Jackson understood that. He puts people in office who are capable of their position. The problem is that others will come along later and say, not so much so. Jackson also will rotate the offices. Now, you eventually had to turn over your portfolio and go to another cabinet post or another cabinet office in order to maintain your position in the government. Jackson also has a close cadre of advisors, which he calls his kitchen cabinet. These are not his cabinet members. Cabinet members often are appointed based upon their position in the electoral vote, on how they did in the primaries and things like that, even though you didn't have primaries back then. But they usually go to people who are, shall we say, the party owes them something. Well, Jackson doesn't want to rely on these people, so he brings in close advisors to help him. We'll have this during the Roosevelt administration, during the New Deal period, when they have the brain trust that Roosevelt will bring in to help along with the cabinet members. But that's, several hundred years, not several hundred, 100 years in the future. Because of Jackson's imperial policy on running the Oval Office, which didn't exist yet, but running the presidential administration, many of his critiques said he was trying to put himself forward as a monarch. Not that he was claiming the title of king or anything like that, but that his power was almost monarchical. And so they started to call him King Andrew. And so it's another reason why the current administration likes him so much. If there was one thing that Andrew Jackson did not like, it was the National Bank. Jackson did not trust the bank. He felt that it was too much financial strength in a single institution. He said that the government was exposed to control by foreign interests. Boy, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? That foreign investors were putting money into this bank. He said that this bank was mainly to make the rich richer. And the bank lobbied in Congress and had control over members of Congress. And he said that the bank favored northeastern states over the South and the West. So when the charter came up and Congress passed the charter, he vetoed the recharter. And then for the remainder of its time, he defunded the National Bank. Now, this is ideological. Economically, it is going to have some serious consequences for the country. Andrew Jackson was the first president ever photographed. You see here a daguerreotype of Jackson long after his retirement, very elderly and very ill by this point. It's a daguerreotype, which means silver plate. During his administration, Jackson knew how to play politics like the best of them. He was a cagey, intelligent lawyer, and he played politics with the public programs, especially when it came to dispensing land. Remember that the federal government, without an income tax, has to sell the land, and it gives federal land to settlers and to squatters. And this increases the movement of population to the west and the south because there's plenty of open land as Jackson is beginning to clear these lands out. Henry Clay says, wait a minute, time out. This is the job of the states to distribute the land. And Jackson, who absolutely hates Henry Clay with a passion because of what he had done in the election of 1824, says, no, 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 we're going to veto that. And so Jackson, again, is trying to assert more power. And Clay, of course, said, well, wait a minute, it's Congress and the states that handles the public domain. And Jackson says, no, it's the presidency. And this is how Jackson's legacy is going to be very important for the next 30 years. It's going to affect all the way up until the Civil War and even after that, as there will be a major confrontation between Congress and the president after the Civil War. And it's based in large part on Andrew Johnson, who is Abraham Lincoln's successor, who sees himself as a Jacksonian Democrat, who says, I am an inheritor of the Jacksonian legacy, and I am the preeminent power in the country. And Congress says, okay, that was fine for about 30 years, and it got us into a civil war. We're going to try and change that around. One of the most shameful legacies of the Jackson administration is what we call the Trail of Tears. In the southeast of the United States lived the 5 civilized nations: Cherokee, Choctaws, Seminoles, Creek, and Chickasaws. They lived in the southeastern United States: Georgia, Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. Many of these Indian tribes lived on land that is now becoming very sought after because of cotton. And Jackson, who of course had a long-standing animus toward especially the Creeks, who had sided with the British, who had brutalized his brother, caused his brother to die in the camp, and so forth, now begins to exact his vengeance. Andrew Jackson was pathological in his hatred of the Indians, in his hate of the Creeks especially, of Henry Clay, and the National Bank. And so he now starts through Congress with his allies the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It removes Indians from fertile lands desired by the cotton planters, and it appropriated funds to purchase all Indian lands east of the Mississippi and then remove all the Indians to reservations. The Cherokees are the ones that are really impacted by this. The Congress passes through the Treaty of New Echota, in which they bargain not with the established Indian chiefs, but by the young up-and-comers, the young Turks among the Cherokees. And this is the Treaty of New Echota. And despite the fact that the Cherokee chiefs protested against this, the Senate ratified it. And so now the Cherokees are expelled. They are forced to travel on the Trail of Tears. Interestingly enough, all the Indian sub-chiefs that agreed to the Treaty of New Echota and caused the Cherokee to be expelled were all assassinated except one. And that one was Stan Waddy. We'll get to Stan Waddy a little bit later. The expelled Cherokees are now forced to travel on either a land or a water route that is called the Trail of Tears. It's called the Trail of Tears because they are leaving their lands. They are leaving their established homes, heading for Arkansas and Oklahoma. It was a very difficult trip. It was not brutal where people died along the way in large numbers. That did not happen. Instead, they were removed, and the Army escorted them. And the Cherokees found that many of the U.S. Army soldiers were very kind to them. They shared their rations with them. They helped them move instead of just escorting them. Many of these soldiers were Irish-born soldiers. They came directly from Ireland, and the Cherokees never lost track of that. We'll get to that a little bit later, but keep that in the back of your minds. What you see here is a map of the National Historic Trail of Tears. It is actually a federally recognized trail that goes from the areas of Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia down the Tennessee River, which was a very, very difficult river back then. That was not an easy path, even though it was on water. Then down the Mississippi, then up the Arkansas to Fort Smith, and eventually into Tahlequah, Oklahoma. So it's a water route and a land route. And eventually in Tahlequah, that would be called the Indian Territory. And it would not become the state of Oklahoma until 1899, and it would be the 46th state. This is a famous painting titled The Trail of Tears, created by Western artist Robert Lindnell in 1942. The artwork depicts the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation from their ancestral homelands in the southeast to the designated Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma during the winter of 1838-1839. The picture is currently housed in the collection of the Woolaroc Museum in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. You see here the dignity that the Indians have despite the difficult circumstances of walking and riding the Trail of Tears. It is one of the reasons why Native Americans are not too fond of the current administration, which has often had a very antagonistic relationship dating back to the days when the Trump casinos were trying to take land to build its casinos from, or manage the casinos from the Indians. The first major constitutional crisis to hit the United States was the issue of nullification in 1832. The issue was that the tariffs that had been enacted from the time of the end of the War of 1812 until the 1830s were consistently hurting the southern states rather than protecting American manufacturers. And by this point, South Carolina and John C. Calhoun, the once ardent nationalists, now felt that states had the power to nullify federal law. That is, they could declare a federal law null and void and not applicable in that state, and that they could actively keep federal agents from enforcing the law. For a while, this was mostly an academic exercise. But when Senator John Hayne and Daniel Webster, Robert Hayne and Daniel Webster went at it in a debate in 1830, it brought the academic issue into reality. Hayne from South Carolina supported nullification, where Webster believed that nullification would undermine the very fabric of the Union. And this causes a split between Jackson and Calhoun, because when Jackson got up at a toast for the annual Thomas Jefferson birthday dinner, he said, "The Union, it must and shall be preserved." And Calhoun, staring down Jackson, said, "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear," which was a public dispute between the president and the vice president, which had never happened, not even in the Adams-Jefferson administration did the disputes ever become public. In 1832, South Carolina called a nullification convention in which they nullified the tariff and prepared their militia to prohibit federal marshals from enforcing customs duties in the port of Charleston. Andrew Jackson then signed into law the Force Bill, which said that federal troops would be sent to South Carolina to enforce the tariffs. Well, you were starting to see the rumblings of maybe some sort of a military action, and then the cooler heads prevailed. And Jackson, while putting forward the Force Bill, also put forward a compromise tariff in which it lowered the tariff regulations. South Carolina, then, knowing that it would probably not win this confrontation militarily, rescinded its tariff nullification, and instead, in a show of more symbolism and face-saving, nullified Jackson's use of force. Both sides claimed victory, but the issue was unresolved. Many believed in the South that states simply had the right not to enforce federal law, and that states could actively thwart the federal government. Well, in 1832, nothing much came of it after the big nullification convention. But 28 years later, nullification would again come to the forefront under another term, secession. This is a cartoon caricature of Andrew Jackson by his detractors, showing him as a king and emperor trampling on the Constitution. You'll recall from earlier notes our three war hawks, the early nationalists of the War of 1812, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. Well, as time went on, Webster, Clay, and Calhoun now are older, and by the 1830s they're at the height of their political power. And there you see Webster getting older, Clay getting older, and there you see John C. Calhoun affecting a very potent stare, the kind of stare that you knew that when you were being looked at, he was looking at you.